Welcome to a new debate of our series supported by the European Parliament. My name is Jorge Valero and I'm responsible for Economy and Jobs Hub at EURACTIV. Today I will host this debate between our two guests, Sven Giegold from the Greens Group and Gunnar Hökmark from the EPP Group, two very active members in the Committee on Economic Affairs. And there is a lot to talk in terms of economy, challenges ahead for this 2019, crucial year for Europe. Also, what should be the priorities for the next Parliament and the next Commission. So let's go straight to the point. Gunnar, how do you see the challenges ahead and what should be the next priorities, the big priorities for the next Commission?
I think the perspective that we are having in the future is quite serious, because we are now entering autumn, or maybe winter is coming, meaning a more difficult time of economic development, where we see all the instabilities coming from the Trump administration, the extremely big deficits, but also the fact that Trump is just now using the American economy as a hostage for his own political purposes, trade issues, but maybe looking at Europe, the fact that we still do have so big differences regarding growth potential between the different member states. A rather big number of member states are very low on the different indexes on competitiveness. So I would say that the most important thing for us to do during the next coming term is to increase the potential growth in all member states coming up to a 3% level, and to increase the number of free trade agreements, in so to say take over the initiative. When America is making itself smaller, we need to get taller. More trade agreements, creating a better international order than the one that we can get from a Trump administration.
Sven, increasing that growth potential will imply further structural reforms, and we see in some countries, for example in France, that they are not very happy with some reforms on some tax increases as well. Inequalities back on the political agenda. So how can we ensure, or how can Europe ensure that everybody gets their fair share?
Well, first of all, I would say I agree very much that there's a lot of need of structural reform in Europe. So the way how we consume, how we produce, is not consistent with the Paris Agreement, with the limits of the planet. So we have a huge loss of biodiversity and a risk to the stability of the ecosystem. So we need to invest in order to transform our industry, our economy, to become consistent with the planet. And at the same time, to make sure that this transition is socially just and economically intelligent. And that means the main objective of economic policy is not simply an abstract GDP growth figure, but it is to make sure that this transformation of the economy works, and that those who win from that transformation share what they earn with those who are losing in that transformation. So therefore, what we want to see from the next Commission is a big program of ecological and social transformation of our economic model, which is of course fully consistent with the idea of a social market economy.
What would be one specific proposal of that big package?
The most important idea, which we'll also defend in the elections, is to invest in European common goods. What we mean with this is we need an energy grid which is ready for 100% renewables. We need big industrial projects to make mobility fully sustainable and get away from fossil fuels. We need a European high-speed railway system, which makes it possible to at least replace a part of the flights, which are very damaging to the environment. And by that way, we will create sustainable jobs. Of course, other people will have economic problems, and we have to help them to move from the unsustainable business fields to the sustainable ones.
More investment, Gunnar, will mean more money needed, and right now the debt levels in many member states is not, let's say, the optimal one. So what kind of mechanisms or financial engineering could be set up in order to finance all these projects?
We know some things by experience. Dirigistic policies have failed everywhere. It's only when you mobilize the whole of a society and the whole of economy that you can reach a development that also can face the very many different challenges we have. I mean, we have the climate challenge, but we also have the challenge of poverty in the world. And we have also the challenge of political instability in our part of the world, as in other parts of the world. We have Russia, we have China, and if Europe can't keep up with this development, if we are not able to have an economic development that is living up to other parts of the world, then we will shrink in political importance. And then our opportunities to defend our main political values will shrink at the same time. Mm-hmm. So we need to be sustainable, but maybe in another way that my dear colleague here means. We need to be sustainable in a number of dimensions. And the only opportunity to secure that we have room and finances in order to do the investments we need is to have growth. Because you can see every country, every economy, where you have a stagnated economy, where you are losing competitiveness, you are losing in environment as well. You are losing in facilities and opportunities. You are losing. And I want European Union and Europe to be a winning part of the world, not winning over others, but being able to win over the challenges we are facing. Mm.
At the end, both more or less agree in the challenges and that we need more growth. But member states, I mean, a bit reflecting on the differences on this table, cannot agree, for example, on completing the economic and monetary union, on having an unemployment insurance scheme, or, for example, on more investment, either public supported or having more private involvement. So how do you see that, let's say, gap between northern countries, southern countries, left-wing or green parties, and right-wing or center-right parties can come together and agree at least on a minimum set of priorities for the next mandate, which will be crucial for Europe?
You know, the difference is not north and south. I mean, on the map it looks like that. But the difference is between the level of structural reforms. Because you can see that in every economy where you have reformed, things are moving forward. When Spain and Portugal, in the end, because of their debt, was forced to reform, we can see now it is a more stable development coming up. They need to do much more. The reason why Scandinavian countries have dealt with the crisis better than other parts is very much because we had the crisis in the beginning of the 90s and we reformed. So what we need to have, we can never reach cohesion regarding social standards just by deciding it here. It will not reach out into reality. But we can reach cohesion by having a cohesion of structural reforms. And it is, I'm sorry to say, is too characteristic to see that in those member states where you have avoided structural reforms, you have not only the lagging behind, but you have also the political instability. Mm. What is happening in France now, I would say, is the heritage of a long term of French politics where you haven't reformed.
Sven?
Well, first of all, I would say cohesion needs both. So you need structural reforms, but they are not an objective in itself. It depends on which ones. So, and there where we disagree is that growth is an objective in itself. Growth is nice to have, but if it destroys the planet, it's bad growth. If it leads to more working poor, it's bad growth. If it leads to innovation and future-oriented jobs, it's good growth. So it really depends what we do and what grows. And therefore, it is critical to increase the speed of innovation. There I would very much agree. And that is bitterly needed, also because the world is getting more competitive and we may not fall behind in that regard. So it's very important to prioritize on the future industries, and there put more innovation speed. That's why I'm frustrated that some member states have, for instance, harmed all the reforms Europe has tried to do for climate change. Some members, including Germany, which would have needed these reforms to have still an advantage in its industrial capacity. The same is true for the Eurozone. It's not so much only left and right. There was a broad majority in the European Parliament to have more common policies on the level of the Eurozone. Some member states were blocking these reforms, so that what we got was not a reform, but only a minute rest of it against all the economic wisdom. So what we need is more courageous policies on the European level to have a more common financial and economic policy. And last one, where I have a disagreement, is cohesion. Not only comes from enabling people to grow and participate, which is important, but it also, and your country demonstrates it, taxation of those who achieve and using that money for the future and for cohesion is also important. And in Europe we have an insane level of tax competition, which makes those who have achieved more paying less. And that is not right, and we need that money from tax cooperation to finance our future investments.
Sometimes this is a debate, so I will clarify some differences here. And two things is, first of all, growth during the last 3 decades in the world has reduced global poverty in levels that we couldn't believe 30 years ago.
Mostly because of China.
In China, but Asia and other parts of the world, the market economy reforms and free trade, globalization, has reached exactly this. So for 30 years ago, 1 billion people were living in what we call relative prosperity. Today it is nearly 5 billion people living in relative prosperity. And this is not destroying the world.
But there's not a disagreement.
I can never accept that fighting poverty, making it possible for families to see their children go to school, making it possible for them to get health care when they get sick, that is not something negative, but that requires growth. And what we as politicians need to do is to secure that we have the rules, securing that we have a growth that is responsible. And may I take one example? In Sweden, I had a rather big role in the 90s and in the 80s regarding energy discussions, where Greens and Socialists were trying to hinder that we developed and kept nuclear power and developed bioenergy. We have, in the last 30 years in Sweden, demonstrated that you can combine growth with reducing CO2 emissions. We have reduced it with nearly 30% and have had a stable growth that is more than most other countries, including Germany.
I think everybody will agree that everybody wants to grow and everybody wants to share that prosperity. It's all about also the sequencing, also when it comes here at European level between risk reduction and risk mutualization. I mean, the sequencing is very important. But unfortunately, we have to start wrapping up. But I just want to ask you a final question to both of you. Almost in a tweet, what will be the #1 priority for the next Monday? We can start with you, Sven.
Well, we want a large investment package in European public goods, financed by fighting tax fraud and tax evasion and financial criminality through tax cooperation on the European level.
Foster innovation and competitiveness, securing that Europe can be a center of global responsible growth.
Very good. From my side, that's all for today. Thank you all for following this debate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.